Ego and Archetype, part 16. We're up to chapter 6. Got my long double espresso. So just to recap on the chapters. So chapter 4 was individuation as a way of life. Right. The search for meaning. Looked at the function of the symbols in the subconscious. Chapter 5, Christ as a paradigm of the individuating ego. Chapter 5, Sending. Chapter 6, being an individual. Sounds simple enough. As always, we start with a quote. It's from Jung again. The sole and natural carrier of life is the individual, and that is so throughout nature. The sole and natural carrier of life is the individual, and that is so throughout nature. Part 1. The a priori existence of the ego. The experience of individuality is a mystery of being which transcends descriptive power. Each person has his own unique version of this experience, which is incommunicable as such. Yet the form of the experience is universal and can be recognized by all men. In fact, it sometimes seems that the goal of the individual's psychic development is to come ever closer to the realization that his own personal, unique individuality is identical with the eternal, archetypal individual. Uniqueness and universality merge as one takes upon himself the fate of being an individual. When we survey the phenomenon of life in all its visible manifestations, what we observe is not a continuum, but rather an almost infinite multitude of discrete units of life in a perpetual state of collision and competition with one another to feed, beget, and survive. From the complex molecular particles that are the viruses to the highest vertebrates, we find that life is carried by indivisible units, each of which has its own autonomous center of being. It is the same for psychic life. The psyche also manifests itself through a multitude of unique, separate centers of being, each of which is a microcosm, an absolutely original center in which the universe reflects itself in a unique and inimitable way. Jung puts at the center of his psychology the process of realizing oneself as an individual, the process of individuation. In psychological types, he defines individuation as follows. In general, it is the process of forming and specializing the individual nature. In particular, it is the development of the psychological individual as a differentiated being from the general, collective psychology. Individuation, therefore, is a process of differentiation, having for its goal the development of the individual personality. End of quote. In the same place, he also defines the term individual. The psychological individual is characterized by its peculiar and, in certain respects, unique psychology. The peculiar character of the individual psyche appears less in its elements than in its complex formations. The psychological individual, or individuality, has an a priori, unconscious existence, but it exists consciously only insofar as a consciousness of its peculiar nature is present, i.e., insofar as there exists a conscious distinctiveness from other individuals. End of quote. Sorry, I'll read the last paragraph again. From Jung. The psychological individual, or individuality, has an a priori unconscious existence, but it exists consciously only insofar as a consciousness of its peculiar nature is present, i.e., insofar as there exists a conscious distinctiveness from other individuals. End of quote. Note the apparently simple and self-evident statement that individuality has an a priori, unconscious existence. On first reading, the full implications of this remark might be missed. A mythological image that says the same thing conveys much more adequately A mythological image that says the same thing conveys much more adequately the impact of its meaning. In the Gospel of Luke, when the people rejoiced that they had power over the demons, Jesus replied, "Do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven." Here is the fuller meaning of the abstract statement that individuality has an a priori, unconscious existence. One's name is written in heaven. In other words, one's unique individuality has a transpersonal origin and justification for being. Elsewhere, Jung puts it in another way. The notion that one's identity has an a priori existence is expressed in the ancient idea that each person has his own individual star, a kind of celestial counterpart, representing his cosmic dimension and destiny. The Star of Bethlehem was Jesus' star, having a brightness commensurate with the greatness of his destiny. Wordsworth expressed the same image in his lines: "The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar." End of quote. The image of the star as a transpersonal center of identity appeared in a woman's dream. Following an important realization that she belonged to herself and not to her husband, she dreamed, "I was outside and saw a star fall, but it did not disappear. It pulsated a few times, then stayed bright and round. It was much closer than any other star, yellow-orange, like a sun but smaller than our sun. I thought to myself, I've seen a new star born." The robe of glory in the Gnostic hymn of the pearl is another symbol of the transcendental center of individuality. The Saviour leaves it behind as he descends to the darkness of Egypt. But when his task is completed and he returns to his heavenly home, the robe of glory comes to meet him. The text reads, "Its splendor I had forgotten. having left it as a child in my father's house. As I now beheld the robe, it seemed to me suddenly to become a mirror image of myself. Myself entire I saw in it, and it entire I saw in myself. That we were two in separateness, and yet again one in the sameness of our forms. In Jonas's excellent commentary on this image, he says, it symbolizes the heavenly or eternal self of the person, his original idea, a kind of double or alter ego preserved in the upper world while he labors down below. Oh, man. Another point worth emphasis is the clear distinction Jung makes in his definition between conscious individuality and unconscious individuality. The process of achieving conscious individuality is the process of individuation, which leads to the realization that one's name is written in heaven. Unconscious individuality expresses itself in compulsive drives to pleasure and power and ego defenses of all kinds. These phenomena are generally described by negatively toned words such as selfish, egocentric, autoerotic, and so forth. Although there is justification for these negative terms, since such behavior can be quite disagreeable to others, the attitude conveyed by these negative words can be quite damaging when the individual applies them to himself. Such pejoratives, if used by the therapist, may only reinforce the patient's own depreciatory attitude toward the unconscious and his own potential wholeness. The fact is that embedded in the manifestations of unconscious individuality lies the supreme value of individuality itself, waiting to be redeemed by consciousness. We will never achieve the lapis by throwing away the prima materia. The same idea is expressed in a somewhat different way in the following passage. Mandala symbolism shows a marked tendency to concentrate all the archetypes in a common center, comparable to the relationship of all conscious contents to the ego. One might perhaps regard the mandala as a reflection of the egocentric nature of consciousness, though this view would be justified only if it could be proved that the unconscious is a secondary phenomenon. But the unconscious is undoubtedly older and more original than consciousness, and for this reason one could just as well call the egocentrism of consciousness a reflection or imitation of the self-centrism of the unconscious. End of quote. We might add to this statement that if egocentrism is the ego's imitation of the self, then it will be by conscious acceptance of this tendency that the ego will become aware of that which is imitating. That which it is imitating. Namely, the transpersonal center and unity of individuality, the self. In my experience, the basis of almost all psychological problems is an unsatisfactory relation to one's urge to individuality. I knew he was just going to say something that just sends you, when he says, like, in my experience, you know what I mean? If you're listening, just try and, think, like, try and project it outwards and look at what he's saying, right? In my experience, the basis of almost all psychological problems is an unsatisfactory relation to one's urge to individuality. And the healing process often involves an acceptance of what is commonly called selfish, power-seeking, or autoerotic. The majority of patients in psychotherapy need to learn how to be more effectively selfish and more effective in the use of their own personal power. They need to accept responsibility for the fact of being centers of power and effectiveness. So-called selfish or egocentric behavior, which expresses itself in demands made on others, is not effective conscious self-centeredness or conscious individuality. We demand from others only what we fail to give ourselves. If we have insufficient self-love or self-prestige, our need expresses itself unconsciously by I read it wrong. By coercive tactics toward others. If we have insufficient self-love or self-prestige, our need expresses itself unconsciously by coercive tactics towards others. And often the coercion occurs under the guise of virtue, love, or altruism. Such unconscious selfishness is ineffectual and destructive to oneself and others. It fails to achieve its purpose because it is blind, without awareness of itself. What is required is not the extirpation of selfishness, which is impossible, but rather that it be wedded to consciousness and thus becomes effective. All the facts of biology and psychology teach us that every individual unit of life is self-centered to the core. The only varying factor is the degree of consciousness which accompanies that fact. The widespread current usage of the Freudian term narcissism is a good example of the general misunderstanding concerning self-love. The myth of Narcissus implies something quite different from an excess of indulgent self-love. Narcissus was a youth who rejected all suitors for his love. In reprisal, Nemesis arranged for him to fall in love with his own reflected image in a pool, and he died in despair at not being able to possess the object of his love. Narcissus represents the alienated ego and cannot love. That is, cannot give interest and libido to life, because it is not yet related to itself. To fall in love with the reflected image of oneself can only mean that one does not yet possess oneself. Narcissus yearns to unite with himself just because he is alienated from his own being. As Plato expressed it so clearly in the Symposium, we love and yearn for what we lack. Narcissism in its original mythological implications is thus not a needless excess of self-love, but rather just the opposite, a frustrated state of yearning for a self-possession which does not yet exist. The solution of the problem of Narcissus is the fulfillment of self-love rather than its renunciation. We meet here a common error of the moralizing ego, which tries to create a loving personality by extirpating its self-love. This is a profound psychological mistake and only causes a psychic split. Fulfilled self-love is a prerequisite to the genuine love of any object and to the flow of psychic energy in general. In the case of Narcissus, fulfillment of self-love or union with the image in the depths requires a descent into the unconscious, a nikaya or symbolic death. That this is the deeper meaning of the Narcissus myth is indicated by certain other details. After Narcissus died, he turned into flower Narcissus. This is the death flower from Nakao, to be stiff or dead. The Narcissus was scared to Hades. The Narcissus was sacred to Hades and opened the doors to his realm of the underworld. Persephone had just picked a Narcissus when the earth opened up and Hades emerged to abduct her. The inescapable conclusion is that narcissism, at least in its original mythological sense, is the way into the unconscious where one must go in quest of individuality. Another implication of the Narcissus myth and the theme of falling in love with one's reflection is brought up by a parallel image found in an Orphic interpretation of the Dionysus legend. When the infant Dionysus was torn to pieces by the Titans, he was said to be playing with, among other things, a mirror. According to Proclus, the mirror was interpreted as meaning that Dionysus saw his own image in matter and went toward it with desire. He yearned for self-realization, like Narcissus. Thus, he became confined in matter, incarnated, and became subject to dismemberment by the Titans. Understood psychologically, this mythologism could refer to an early phase of development during which the primitive ego, still identified with the unconscious totality, begins to function in spatio-temporal reality, embraces matter. But reality is hostile to the inflated state of unconscious totality, ego self-identity, and dismembers it. Wow. Reality is hostile to the inflated state of unconscious totality, ego self-identity, and dismembers it. Later phases of development then lead to the recollection. The subjective experience of individuality is a profound mystery that we cannot hope to encompass by rational understanding. However, some of its implications can be approached by examining the symbolic images that refer to this experience. Let us begin by looking at the testimony of etymology. Etymology is the unconscious side of language. Hence, it is relevant in psychological studies. The word individual derives from the two Latin roots in equals not and dividir equals to divide. Its basic meaning is therefore something that is invisible. This corresponds to the fact that the experience of individuality is primary. It cannot be analyzed or reduced to simpler elements. It is interesting to note that such a fundamental concept as the individual must be expressed in terms of what it is not, i.e., not divisible. The same phenomenon occurs with the word atom. The basic unit of matter, from the Greek a equals not, and ton, from temnin, equals to cut, divide. It appears again in the words integer and integrate, from the Latin in equals not, and tag, base of tangere, equals to touch. It seems that in attempting to describe such a basic fact as individuality, we must resort to the same procedure as used in describing deity. Since it is a fact that transcends our categories of conscious understanding, we can do no more than describe it in terms of what it is not. The so-called via negativa. The word individual is etymologically related to the word widow. According to Skid, widow derives from a lost cognate verb, videre, meaning to part. Jung has demonstrated that the images of widow and orphan are part of the individuation process. In this connection, he quotes Saint Augustine as saying, "The whole church is one widow, desolate in this world." And Jung adds, so too the soul is destitute in this world. The quotation from Augustine then continues, "But thou art not an orphan, thou art not reckoned as a widow, thou as a friend, thou art God's orphan, God's widow." Widow means the parted one. Hence, prior to widowhood, one is not yet an individual, indivisible, but is still subject to a parting process. The symbolism tells us that widowhood is an experience on the pathway to the realization of individuality. In fact, that individuality is the son of the experience, of that experience. This can only mean that man must be parted from that on which he is dependent, but which he is not, before he can become aware of that which he is, unique and indivisible. Sorry, let me just read that whole part again. The symbolism tells us that widowhood is an experience on the pathway to realization of individuality. In fact, that individuality is the son of that experience. This can only mean that man must be parted from that on which he is dependent, but which he is not, before he can become aware of that which he is, unique and indivisible. A dependent projection must be broken. Similar implications apply to the image of the orphan, which was a synonym for the alchemist's philosopher's stone. To be orphaned denotes the loss of parental support and the breaking of parental projections. It is likewise a prerequisite of the conscious experience of individuality. As Augustine puts it, to be a widow or orphan relates one to God, the self.